Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. As Patrick has already said, I was involved in student politics in my time here. I did mathematics, in fact, as my degree, and we had many different parties on our executive, from the broad left to the Conservatives, to the Greens, to the Socialist Workers' Party. In fact, it was my first experience of coalition government, it has to be said. I've since had many more. And for 2 heady weeks, I think we occupied the Senate building over rents. So it was rather disconcerting to come back last year and be given an honorary degree. So there is redemption after all in this world. Look, thank you for inviting me to speak. What I want to talk about really is to give you some reflections on local economic growth. I'll come to the issue of the civil service at the end if I can. And in particular, I want to talk about the challenges and opportunities for England's cities and the reforms that the government's putting in place. There's 4 areas I want to cover. First of all, the importance that we now face in our cities, and in fact this is an important time for our cities. Secondly, the wider context of the economy. Thirdly, the contribution that England's cities make to economic growth. And fourthly, what this means for government, the choices for policymakers and the new tools and incentives for cities. Local economic growth and our cities are high on the political agenda. The government's priorities of restoring economic growth, rebalancing our economy and returning power to local communities each put cities at the heart of policy making. Since we've had the coalition government, we've seen a radical change in the landscape for local economic growth. And now we have an important contribution from Lord Heseltine. His review, No Stone Unturned, in Pursuit of Growth, is a challenge to us all in the public and private sectors in how to unleash the dynamic potential of our cities. This all builds on recent economic thinking about the roles of cities in a modern economy, including the new economic geography pioneered by Nobel Prize-winning Paul Krugman, Harvard's Edward Glaeser's book, The Triumph of the City, and the work of the Spatial Economics Research Centre. This work encourages lively debate, which is vitally important for the work that we're doing. Good research and good evidence are essential to developing good policy. The government's reforms for cities are taking place in challenging economic times. And let me just show you the extent of that in the first slide. From 2008 and the financial crisis, our economy is contracted by about 6%. Now, if we move to the second slide, we can see that the economy is recovering, but slowly. Forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility suggests that growth will remain below trend until 2016. In contrast to GDP, however, employment remains quite resilient. There is jobs growth in the private sector and high participation in the labour market. This is a good news story, but we recognise it also poses challenges for productivity and wages. Looking ahead, we face some long but pretty sustained trends: an ageing population, new patterns of migration, the clear shift in the world economy towards Asia and South America, the big environmental challenges of climate change and future energy needs. Each of these has very specific repercussions for where we live and work, which takes me neatly to England's cities. England is an urbanised country. Most of our population lives in cities. Most of our jobs are in cities. Most of our economic activity is produced within cities. Of the 23 million jobs in England, almost 20% are in Greater London. If you add in Greater Manchester, Birmingham with the Black Country and the city regions of Bristol, Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, Nottingham and Newcastle, you increase that number from 20% to 50%. So almost half of England's employment is in London and the core cities. And that's before we even think about the next tier of cities, from Cambridge, Coventry and Milton Keynes to Plymouth, Southampton, York and Carlisle. Our national economy, therefore, is largely the sum of our cities. Put simply, cities matter. Cities shape England's economic geography. When we talk in simple terms of the north-south divide and persistent regional disparities, we can really only understand the story of regional disparities by looking at our cities. All cities have a developed urban hierarchy, with a few large cities and many smaller ones, and England's no different in this. However, the pattern is much more pronounced here. London, one of the world's truly global cities, has a strong pulling effect. But in reality, the urban landscape of England today reflects the economic choices of earlier centuries. This country was the first industrial nation. We saw the growth of our cities around the needs of industries. Many of our cities of the North and Midlands developed close to coal deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution. Manchester grew in a damp climate perfect for working with cotton. The potteries of Stoke-on-Trent emerged by the clay of Staffordshire. The ports of Bristol and Liverpool were built on sea trade with Britain's colonies across the Atlantic. Seaside resorts such as Brighton grew around access to the rail network. We live with the urban legacy of the 19th century. Through much of the 20th century, growth in our cities was driven by new types of enterprises, business services for which access to customers and skilled workers mattered. Our trade became more closely linked with Europe, favouring southern England. The road network freed cities to expand. Airports provided completely new international gateways. Looking back over the last 50 years, we can see the rise of the skilled city, the contraction of industrial cities as manufacturing jobs moved overseas, suburbanisation as transport costs have fallen, and the emergence of a mega-city region in southeast England. Now, since 2008, we have had some challenging times, and that's affected the economies of all of our cities. The geographic impact of this downturn, though, has been more muted than past recessions. This is in part because employment has held up, as I said earlier, but it's also because the downturn has affected sectors that are everywhere, like construction, retail and public services. It differs in this respect from the 1980s or 1990s, when job losses in manufacturing were heavily concentrated within certain parts of the country, like Sheffield. The fascinating story is with the resilience of London. The action that government has taken to support the banking industry, the continuing inflows of international migrants, and a favourable exchange rate have attracted overseas visitors and investors, and all have played the part in supporting London's continued growth. But those cities with weaker economies, with less strong entrepreneurial base and a lower skilled population and a greater dependence on declining industries in the public sector, have proved less resilient. Cities such as Birmingham have experienced industrial decline even in the growth years, and they have been the most affected by the downturn since 2008. Manchester and Leeds were making economic gains, as you can see from this slide, but have seen their progress stall. We don't know how cities will respond to future change. We can see the changes that will take place that will impact on them. The ongoing shift of the global economy, demographic changes, new technologies, environmental constraints. We can speculate how each of these will impact on cities, but we truthfully don't really know. It's as hard to pick which cities will be winners as what businesses or sectors will be winners. And London provides a really good example of this. In the 1970s and 80s, London was losing jobs and people. Its industries and ports were in decline, and people were moving away. The expectations for the London economy were poor. Investment stalled, transport infrastructure was not modernised, and houses were not built. And yet, despite of this, London recovered strongly. The forecasts, to put it simply, were wrong. We should take a step back, therefore, and consider the economics of why cities exist. In my view, the answer lies in locational choices. People choose to live where they can benefit from access to jobs, a good income, a social life, and things to do. They trade off against costs, the price of housing, or a congested environment. Businesses choose to locate where they can benefit from access to workers, customers, and suppliers. They trade off against the costs of property, labour, and transport. Developers choose to build properties where they can sell or rent. They trade off against the cost of land and developers. When we talk about local economic growth, we're often really talking about locational choices. Our economic growth needs people and enterprises to locate in a place where they are productive. People choosing where they can be best lead their lives, businesses choosing where they can be most successful. For some, the choice takes them to the countryside. For others, to small towns. For most, it is to the cities. A city is a sum of the individuals that have chosen to be there. That is, people who have chosen proximity with other people and the opportunities for human interaction that generates growth. That is what economists and geographers mean when they talk about agglomeration. Places where individuals and firms can share common resources such as infrastructure, better match needs with provisions such as workers or suppliers, and where individuals and firms can learn from each other. Cities are a great invention. They allow us to be smarter, greener, healthier, and happier. So what makes for a successful city? Well, success can be measured in different ways. Success can be about growing population, or it can be about a prosperous labour force, or it can be about broader measures of well-being. We've learned that there are many factors that come together to shape the outcomes of cities. The history, which determines the city's economic base, economic diversity, avoiding dependence on only a few businesses, a skilled workforce, innovation by firms and other organisations, including universities, connectivity both within the city and externally, quality of life and its influence on attracting workers, and effective city leadership to create conditions for success. Given this complexity, we are bound to have different and uneven growth across our cities. The challenge for policymakers and analysts is to decide in this complex and uncertain world what are the policy choices for government, what to prioritise, where to invest. Should government encourage investment in those places that we think may bring rapid economic growth, or support those places with weak economies but potential for growth? Should investment be prioritised on our large cities or our small cities? Should we prioritise investment in housing in London or Oxford? Should we target transport investment in Birmingham over Coventry? The choices we make have costs. The costs of new infrastructure and new homes in growing places, the costs associated with declining places such as underused infrastructure, and the social costs of the people we leave behind. These are the difficult questions we face. What government seeks to do is to create the conditions for growth so that every part of the country has the opportunity to realise its potential. That involves removing the barriers that prevent businesses and people from making the best choices. We focus our attention on what government can do to overcome these barriers. Cities can make an impact at a national level through our policies on education, enterprise, land and planning and transport. However, preparing our cities for future success cannot and should not solely be left to the policies of central government. There are good economic arguments that make the case for local decision making and local provision, better information, the costs of delivery, capturing local benefits, innovation and competition. Of course, there's potential trade-offs, but we're clear in government that the need to ensure decisions must be made at the right geographic level. That's why the government wants to give back power to cities. We want to build on the different strengths across the country. We want to address the barriers that are holding back different parts of the country. In 2010, the government established local economic partnerships that bring together businesses and communities to shape the economic futures of their areas. We gave back greater powers to the Mayor of London. In the last 12 months, we've established city deals, a first wave with the 8 core cities and now a second wave with the smaller cities across the country. Every city deal aims to give us the powers and tools they need, unlock projects or initiatives that will boost their economies and deliver a step change in governance. With the decentralisation of cities and local economic partnerships comes the tools to deliver growth, a new homes bonus, localising business rates and new grants. As we look ahead, our work is focused on the recommendations of Lord Heseltine, that government departments pool resources into a single pot available to local enterprises to support growth. How we take forward his recommendations, how we make the most of European funds, how we devolve more power and responsibility at a local level are big and important issues for the civil service of the future. The economic challenges remain, the constraints of the public purse remain, but this is an exciting time for new ideas and new approaches for our cities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sir Bob. We have plenty of time for questions, so yeah, there we go. Are there any questions for Sir Bob? Yeah, we have one here.
Hi, thank you very much for your speech. I'm currently studying at Bristol, and we're one of the few cities which recently chose to elect our own local mayor, arguably quite a strong step on decentralisation. However, a lot of other cities refused, or at least turned down this offer, and arguably there's a bit of a spectator elements going on here. What do you think were generally the main reasons behind this, and what do you think are some of the main challenges in discussing with local government on what sort of powers should be decentralised and placed in the hands of more local representatives?
Well, I think mayors can be a very powerful model of leadership in cities, and I'm, in fact, by coincidence, meeting the Mayor of Bristol on Monday afternoon. I think myself, though, the key issue is what's the most effective model of governance for a city. And in some places, a mayor will be right, and in some places, it'll actually be a strong leader of a local authority, particularly working closely with his colleagues in the wider city region for that city. Because most of the cities we have in this country are not bounded entirely by their city, they have a wider area. So I think, why do people choose different options? I suspect it's the extent to which they could see either a compelling case for change in their own city, was it working at the moment, or actually they could see a compelling need for stronger leadership because the city itself was struggling. So to some extent, referenda are intrinsically conservative. That's the experience with a small c. I think what tips the balance in some places is that they can see the opportunity and the potential of a new model, and they went for it. But I don't think success relies on a mayor. It's a powerful model, but there are other models that can work just as well. And Manchester, I think, is a good example of that.
Okay. Do we have more questions? Yeah, there's one at the back up there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. You said that the geographic disparities of this crisis are more muted than previous crises.
Yeah.
I see what you mean. But could the same be said for the outcomes of government policy in reaction to the crisis?
I think let me just give you an illustration of the point on why I say it's more muted. If the city I ran for as chief executive for over a decade was Sheffield, and it was mentioned in the introduction. Now, Sheffield, in the period before I arrived, lost something like a quarter of its jobs. The impact was quite devastating on that city, and a quarter of its jobs in the steel industry. And the time it took to recover from that was very dramatic. It's kind of illustrated if you've seen the film The Full Monty. The scale and nature of the change was very, very dramatic. That's not, of course, to say that places are not being affected by the downturn now, and the graph I showed illustrated that. But the impact this time is less acute in its effect. I think in part because we haven't seen the same combined effect of a huge industrial shift as we saw in places like Sheffield. So in terms of government policy, I think the government, as I said earlier, are very clear that they want to secure, introduce policies that will secure the best results from every city. And so to that extent, we're not prescribing the actions for Birmingham, Sheffield, Leeds. We are trying to create the conditions when those places can succeed at their best. What I think is particularly difficult for some of those cities is that over time they built up quite a high dependence on public sector jobs, and that's been the area where the biggest reductions have occurred. So we've got two things working against each other to some degree here: the impact of reductions in the public sector and the desire to create more dynamic and better led economies at local level. And time will tell how that plays out.
Okay, we have a question down here at the front.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had a quick question regarding the local economic partnerships you talked about.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how they rate in light of some of the trends you talked about. For example, aging population, migration, and the environmental impacts of economic activity.
I think it's early days, to be frank. I think they are a very powerful model, or potentially a very powerful model, for a number of reasons. First of all, they're based on natural economic geographies. One of the challenges of the regional model is that they were always artificial boundaries. What we've sought to do for the local economic partnerships is to create local geographies, the natural economic footprint, if you like, for those places. Secondly, I think what's powerful about them is that they are very much leadership models. They're not trying to do everything. They're trying to, if you like, combine, coalesce the key forces in an area to drive it towards an economic outcome. That, I think, makes them more fleet of foot. What I say it's early days is they've only been, if you like, up and running for less than a couple of years. And therefore, the impact they can have will take a lot longer to see through. We see some who are making a real impact on growth and restructuring of their economies. Others are taking more time about it. So it's a question I think we'll be better able to answer in perhaps 2 or 3 years' time, if I'm honest with you.
Okay. We have a question in the middle there.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. And my question is, there was a recent article in, I believe, The Economist about whether or not the strong focus on London in the last 20 years stifled growth and development in other large cities, like, for example, Manchester or Birmingham. And I would like to know, what is your take on that?
Actually, it's not a view I hold, nor I think is it, in a sense, correct to say that there's been a focus on London, actually. I think one of the remarkable things I showed in my slides is how London turned itself around in many respects from a point when I first came into government, if you like. I don't think there's any coincidence, by the way, that I was in London when it was going down. But it turned itself around remarkably, really, from a history of falling population and falling economy to a growth one. And much of that happened, I think, through the internal dynamics of London itself, and not through, say, a conscious government policy to that effect. But when I was in Sheffield as the chief exec, we actually never made the argument that it was either us or London. Our view was that London was a global city, actually, and it was in our interests for London to succeed. It wouldn't be in our interests in Sheffield, Manchester and Birmingham for London to underperform. What was important, though, was to have economic policies, complementary economic policies, that made the most of those cities. And our thesis was that the thing that held them back was the need for strong leadership at city-region level and the need for more power and more ability to do things locally. And I still think those arguments hold, actually. I think our regional cities can and will prosper in the future, but they need to have more power and more local responsibility to do that. And so I don't think it is a London versus the rest. I think actually London complements and indeed can, particularly if we improve transport connections, strengthen the growth opportunities of other cities. I think the illustration of that point is in what I would call the meta-city region. I referred to that in my speech. Places like Reading, for example, started from their interrelationship with London, but have grown quite strong internally dynamic economies. And I think that's the way we could see cities growing in the future.
Okay, do we have any more questions? We have one right down at the front here.
Can I ask you about the place of universities as part of that urban growth model? And I'm particularly interested in the fact that in Sheffield, in Birmingham, these places are characterized by really remarkable universities that are actually global universities that attract, for instance, a lot of overseas students. If it is very difficult for these overseas students then to remain in this country and to get a visa, doesn't that really stifle urban growth?
Let me just say first of all about the importance of universities, which is the easy part of your question. The second bit is a bit harder. I think on the first part of your question, what we're seeing, I think there's a huge interconnection between universities and cities because of the change in the economic structure of this country. Moving towards a service economy, moving towards an economy that survives and prospers on innovation and manufacturing. All of these things point to the critical connection between universities and cities. I think it's always been true that it was the case, but I think it's even more the case now. What I do think I've observed in my time was a much stronger connection between cities and their universities. I can remember in my time when I was a student here, there was to a large extent to which people saw the university here and the city here and very little connection at all. And that's changed out of all recognition now, and I think all to the good. The issue of visas, I think, is a challenging one because there are, as you know, some competing policy issues for government. What is clear is that government have said there's no limit on the number of students who can come from different countries, and the aim is to make the processes simpler and more straightforward on things like visas. But there's a balancing act that's going on here. I'm sure Vince Cable would have said if he'd spoken this morning about the importance of students into this country, I would say the same, but also government has to attend to wider policies, as you know. That's all I'll say on that subject. Okay, other questions?
If we have no other questions, then can we thank Sir Bob again for his time today?
Thank you.